mentioned that there's been resistance to labeling other things genocide as well, but something about this being tied to China specifically made things worse. Why did that matter?
Well, China's a very large and important country, big trading partner of the United States, obviously. At that time, it was during the COVID pandemic. And while um, public sentiment had certainly started to turn on China during that time period, we were still fairly early days in terms of the effort to basically shift the long running, the 30 shift from 30 decades of engagement focused US China policy to a more competitive and confrontational posture. We had made a lot of ground during the Trump administration on that point, but 30 years of programming, if you will, of our diplomatic and security and economic institutions in a certain pro-engagement trajectory and direction, it's not easy to turn that aircraft carrier in basically 180 degrees to view China as our primary threat, as the national security strategy articulated, and to really start to change the way our institutions operate. We're still actually in early days in that process. If you look at some of the ways that that our agencies still deal with the People's Republic of China and still if anything, underestimate the threat of Chinese influence operations in the United States and China's threat as an as a coercive economic actor in the geopolitical space.
Now, this leads to the next question. The U.S. was using the UN Genocide Convention for this. I know from your time at the UN that you saw that China is a very powerful force in the UN. So what was the UN's take on using the UN Genocide Convention to label China as a perpetrator of genocide and crimes against humanity?
Well, I would say that if you step back to the time that I was at US UN, at the US mission to the United Nations in New York in 2017 and 2018, when again, we were still at the very beginning of trying to push back on China's malign influence at the United Nations. Top to bottom, side to side, the United Nations did not want to even talk about what was happening in the Uyghur region and to the Uyghur people and the other the Turkic Muslim ethnic minority people in this area. They didn't want to acknowledge that anything bad was happening. They, in fact, were quite happy to praise China as a leader in meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, as a partner on addressing climate change, as a better global citizen than the United States, because Xi Jinping and Chinese diplomats would come to the United Nations and to the related agencies and say the magic words like praise the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030 and all of these things that were close to the heart of the Secretary General and the bureaucracy at the UN, the kind of permanent, the Secretariat, and all of these UN bureaucrats that their jobs depend on advancing these SDGs and this operating system that they work against. And Beijing had figured out that they could just come in and commit themselves to these Sustainable Development Goals and say that they were going to support them, and that was because the United States was coming in and being critical about the UN and its performance and its functionality and its problems. They liked the Chinese message much better than ours, and so it was really hard to get anybody, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Secretary General, any of the to to acknowledge that there was anything wrong at all, let alone a genocide. We were so far away from that conversation between 2017 and 2022 that it was hard to imagine that they would even come out with the kind of reporting that the Office of the High Commissioner came out with in 2022 that acknowledged that there might be crimes against humanity happening in against the Uyghur people.
Well, in 2018, I believe the U.S. actually pulled out of the United Nations Human Rights Council. Right. So didn't that make it more difficult to deal with this kind of thing?
So I was obviously working at the mission at that time, and the Human Rights Council's in Geneva, and we did not have an ambassador in Geneva. So I was doing a lot of double duty. Ambassador Haley had brought me on board because of my human rights background, and so we were working on a package of reforms for the Human Rights Council at that time. And I was also involved in a lot of the lobbying around trying to push back on a Chinese resolution in the Human Rights Council that talked about what so-called win-win cooperation in the field of human rights. That this resolution basically, so I know it would be funny if it wasn't so horrifying.
I mean, it's still funny, honestly, if you know what win-win means, but yeah.
Well, and that was the problem, right? In 2018, 2017, not very many of my colleagues did understand what Beijing meant by win-win and mutually beneficial cooperation. You know, we had a joke, it means China wins twice when they say win-win, and everybody else loses. And this is, and we, you know, but trying to get that through to our colleagues at that time was really, really difficult. And again, the Uyghur genocide was already well underway by then, and you still, and I'm talking about our closest allies, our Five Eyes allies, and that group plus some of the UN member states in the European and other in the kind of in the European group who hold themselves out as like the highest avatars of human rights in the system, that, you know, they are so committed to human rights. But when it came to talking about China's human rights violations, they were like, oh, we're going to do win-win cooperation with them and help bring them into the system, and it's going to be great. And I'm looking at these people like, I mean, are you on crack? Like, what are you doing? It was just insane. And so we had to do a lot of retail diplomacy to just an education of colleagues who they believed Beijing when they came into these multilateral settings and said, we love the UN. We want to place the UN at the center of the multilateral universe, and we are going to support the SDGs with everything we've got. In fact, we're going to, you know, the Belt and Road is the SDGs, and the SDGs are the Belt and Road. And these people were like, yay, that's wonderful. And I'm like, oh my God, again, what is wrong with all of you? It was, I felt sometimes like I was in the upside down, in the, you know, it was just crazy. So as someone who had a long background of dealing with China and knowing how the party thinks and what the party means when they say these things, and dealing with colleagues who just took it all at the most, you know, face value, rose-colored way, it was pretty insane.